to share with you about why we have this housing crisis, if that's what you want to call it, because I've lived through so many housing crises in my life that this one doesn't strike me as any more out of the ordinary than some of the others. However, I wanted to also give you an economics lesson, Economics 101, which I've been teaching forever. And it's like, I'm not Jim Cramer, I'm not CNBC. I watch those channels and I think, okay, we've made this way too complicated. So let's talk about this house that I want to share with you for a moment, because I think that is very illustrative of what has happened to the market. Like, everybody's so excited about the housing and the unaffordability of housing. Okay, I'm going to give you a history lesson in another video because I don't want to convolute it with this one. But we've had this before, only worse. So the idea that people are so stuck in this moment instead of looking at it from a bigger 10,000 foot view and perspective honestly cracks me up, but that's life in general these days. So I'm going to talk about this house that my buyer and I found. Not going to give addresses or anything like that. Not going to give you pictures. Suffice it to say, it was about a 1,300 square foot house, 3-bedroom, 2-bath, and it's had several iterations since the moment right before what I call the unicorn years or that pandemic period. So this little tiny 3-bedroom, 2-bath house, very cute, built in 1955. That's kind of important. It's a pier and beam, so that also adds to the conversation. And you can watch this channel and understand what those things mean: slabs, pier and beam, etc. But this house in 2018, because that's how far back our multiple listing service here goes, if you want to see things on the computer. In 2018, this little house that's currently on the market now sold for, it was asked, asking price back then was $109,500, and it sold for $114,500. Now, first of all of you who are watching this should be going, 2018, that was before the pandemic, why would it sell for more than the asking price? So I'm going to do another video after this one about whether or not you should ask a seller to pay your closing costs, but I'll give you a little hint right here. In this particular case, this house sold, the buyer offered $114,500, and they ended up asking for $5,000 in closing costs, meaning the seller would pay the buyer's closing costs. This was a VA loan that the buyer had, so that they actually increased the purchase price so that the seller didn't lose money. In effect, they still were offering $109,500, but the closing costs end up being calculated into the purchase price, which ends up being calculated into the loan, which means that $5,000 is ultimately financed. So for those of you that are doing VAs, please look at my videos about VA loans, because it shares a lot of information about a VA loan. So here's the thing. This house sold for $114,500 in 2018. Okay, we don't know what it was before that because I didn't go back to go manually look this up. But here's the thing. What's important is this arc of time that we're talking about: pre-pandemic, pandemic, and then afterwards. And so all of you know the cost of rent, the cost of housing has gone up. Okay, we all get that. But the conversation is so convoluted about it's terrible instead of looking about, oh, why did that happen? So when I get to the economics part, we'll talk about that, but let's look at the trajectory of this house. In 2020, the same house that sold in 2018 with basically no changes to it, there weren't any because I can look and see the listing. So it was had an asking price of $149,900. And it sold for $145,000. Now, 2020, this is right at that point where the market started to heat up. Okay, so keep that in mind, that all these prices started to go crazy in 2020. I was doing real estate in Wichita Falls going, whoa, this is wild. Now, there was a trifecta of things that was happening at that point. There was a limited amount of inventory. We had historically low interest rates, And we had a generation called the millennials that finally got into the market and said, oh, we want to buy a house, because they had sort of been sitting on the sidelines at that point. So the thing is that's important to note here is that this house was increased in price from 2018 to 2020 by $30,000, 28%. Okay, that is a ridiculous amount of money, but that's what was happening in 2020 and 2021, is the real estate market was so overheated because of one thing. It's called supply and demand. So here's where the economic lesson comes in. This is economics 101. I don't care if we talk about puts and calls and hedge funds and shorts and all the things you can do, and the price per how much things cost, and businesses and what they're worth, and all of those crazy things. They all boil down to a bottom line of income for a company is based on supply and demand. Because if you've got a widget that you're selling that nobody wants, or it's obsolete, or it doesn't work in the market anymore, no one's going to buy it. So the equation is, when you have a shortage of supply and you have a high demand, prices go up. That is how the market works. I had a great mentor one time who said, the market is always right. I love that saying, because we all want to pretend like something is wrong or off or whatever. The market is always right. Who is the market? You're the market. You're the market. You're the market. We are the market. I used to use this example when I was teaching how to read appraisals to underwriters back in the day. So I'm, a 70s child. Back in the day, we had this thing called a Cabbage Patch doll. And every child in the freaking universe, it felt like, wanted this Cabbage Patch doll. And guess what? There weren't any. It's like a Super Bowl ticket or a soccer game ticket. Once you drill it down and there aren't any more left, people will pay more than what its face value is. That is what's called supply and demand. So what happened in 2020 and 2021 is that we had a shortage of inventory, a high demand because of the reasons I just stated, and guess what? People were overbidding the real value of a property. And a lot of them were paying cash, so they got it anyways. You didn't have to have an appraisal done. That was the thing, is an appraisal would never have supported that because of what was happening in the economy. Now, in this particular case, because the whole world was on fire, this VA happened to get an appraisal done. And I can't comment on, I didn't represent either one of those people. But the thing is that appraisers also were seeing the market overheat, and they could support it with other properties in the area that were selling for crazy town. So here's what happens. In 2020, that's what happened. In 2021, that's just a year later. So typically you hold on to a house 3 to 5 years, 3 to 7, and you can get the appreciated value. I've done videos on why it's better to buy than it is to rent, but not if you're going to own the house for a year. Well, in 2021, this same house, this exact same house, the listing price was $172, and it sold for $170. Okay, so it's gone from $109.5 to $170, $25,000 more than the year before, and that's a 17% increase. 17 plus 28, what is that? Almost 40%. It increased because of the market. It wasn't because people were sitting around, let's be greedy, I'm going to ask for this price. No, it was because I was in that market. The inventory was so constricted. Remember, supply, there wasn't enough for all of the buyers, so they were just scrambling to buy whatever they could. So this house then went up another 17%. Okay? Then in 2023, these people that owned it here, 2 years later, they had another asking price of $187,000. It sold for $187,000. This is the current sellers right now. They paid $1,000, or they had the seller pay $1,000 in closing costs. They did a VA loan too. Now keep in mind, every time a VA loan was put into play, which was here, this was conventional, and was here, the buyer, whether or not the seller paid their closing costs, paid a VA funding fee, which added to the amount they owe against the property. There's nothing wrong with a VA loan. There's nothing wrong with a VA funding fee. But if you're buying property and you're especially buying at VA, you need to be aware. You need to have a mortgage person and a real estate professional that share with you all of the consequences of what is happening in this particular scenario. So this was another $17,000 increase over the 2 years prior to that. Another 10% increase. Now, here's the big bugaboo, and this is what happens is when we also have a shortage of inventory, which has continued to a certain degree because people are holding on to their properties. They've got these low interest rates. Their rate locked in is what we call it. But the problem is that they're not, if you have a house that's a nice looking house, it's going to attract more people for one house. So I'm going to guess, because I wasn't there at the time, but that this went really fast because in 2023, the market was constricting. The market was constricting a lot. So there was less inventory then than there is now, which there's not very much now, of houses that people want to move into that are move-in ready. So they increased it 10% over what this buyer paid 10% over what they had 2 years prior. 2 years. And the market typically, in a normal market, which I don't even know when was the last time we were in a normal market, the valuation of a house, especially in Wichita Falls, will increase 3 to 5, maybe 7%. Then it depends on what you've done with the house. Here's the thing, is that that's not been going on. As a matter of fact, it's been going down on certain years during that same time frame. So 10% over market was too high. So they bought it for too high. They bought it for too high, meaning that eventually the market was going to correct. Now, does anybody here have the foresight to see here? Well, sadly, we don't have a time machine or a crystal ball. However, I can tell you, they were excited to buy that house because I could tell by what they offered. And that doesn't mean that somebody else wouldn't have done it also. So fast forward, it's today. The same house. There have been minor improvements. They updated a bathroom. They put some flooring in differently. So yeah, there could have been around this period of time some changes, but they just carried over for these buyers, which they took the benefit of it, but they didn't do the investing part in it. So here's what happens. Today, the house is listed for $205. $18,000 more, 9% increase over that 10%. So we're looking at almost 70% between 28, 17, 10, and 9 for a house that has had very little improvements. Primarily, it's really important to note that once we started doing an inspection on this property, the foundation, it's a 1955 house. There's no evidence that that's ever been taken care of. It was pier and beam. The HVAC system, the outside unit, which is the air conditioning, had been updated about 7 years ago. But the outside or the inside unit, which is the furnace, because it's gas, was not updated for 30 years. So that takes away from the value rather than adding to the value. The roof was 12 years old. Even though the roof was in fairly substantially good condition, it's still 12 years old. So the buyer's going to have to pay for the insurance premiums that the insurance company is going to attach to a 12-year-old roof. They frankly don't even care how good the roof is. They just go by age because it's another algorithm. And the electric was a tube situation. So that electric hadn't been updated for, I don't know, probably 30 years. And there was evidence of a fire in one of them. So a couple of things. Electric is not something you want to fool around with, but because this house was a 1955 house, very few updates had been done. And yet, because of the market, we're looking at this overall increase in price of almost 70% from 2018, which is 8 years ago. So if you divide that out, you're looking at around 9%, 10% per year increase. This time right here, 2021, were the unicorn years because all bets were off. But here's the thing, is now that we're in a time where we're readjusting, we're still in this moment of a shortage of inventory. So as I work with buyers, especially buyers that want a move-in ready, beautiful house, no green carpet, no wallpaper, no this from a dated house, they don't see a vision. So I'm going to say something that has been the standard for every real estate transaction for the last, century, it seems like. If you want to get the best deal, because really that's what you're looking for. If you want to build wealth, generational wealth in real estate, you want to buy a house, because real estate buying is an emotional process. And so what I can say is I would be willing to bet that this person and this person both bought from an emotional perspective. And then my buyer was about to make that same choice for an emotional reason, because of the look that you look at something without looking down underneath what's happening, which we did. And ultimately that decision was changed because this seller can't go much lower than this because of their purchase over here. So let's say you're a VA buyer. Let's say you bought a house for $187,000 and you pay a funding fee on top of it. So let's say it's $3,000. Let's say you're at $190,000. Then you're going to add 6% when you sell the house to pay a real estate agent. And there's other closing costs, not a tremendous, but that just takes you to a place where you can't get below $2,000 on your sales transaction without, number one, which I was told by the real estate agent that she was cutting their commission in order to facilitate that because he'd already sold them the property. Here's the thing, is that you want a real estate agent and a mortgage professional that sees this 10,000 foot view and constantly tells you what has been going on. Because I will say this to every buyer always. I will tell you what the market value is. I will never force you to do anything because that's not my job. My job is to give you information. And if you still make an emotional decision, which he did, you're going to have to live with that consequence. I don't know if that happened in these cases, but the fact is that that's what's causing this real estate situation. This is one property in one community, but this is happening nationwide. Now, we've had these real estate bubbles and explosions before, from the early 70s when I couldn't even remember thinking, and through the 80s and through the 90s. And what happens is, if you remember 2008, we did go up, but then we came back down. And here's the problem, is we haven't come down in this particular case. You know why? Is because everybody still makes the same amount of money as they were making. I know that sounds crazy, but you're still able to spend money. And when you are able to spend money and you want what you want, which is a house, you're going to pay what you think you have to pay rather than being patient, rather than finding the best deal on the block. You know, you see signs about people, we buy ugly houses. Sometimes an ugly house is the best value. With a little paint, a little this and a little that, you can reconstitute something and make it your own. But we get so locked into, we want it to look the way that we want it. I did a video on starter homes recently that, please check that out because I think it's hilarious that y'all want this HGTV look instead of taking the time to understand what the economics are and how you build wealth in this process. I have always talked about owning real estate, but it's from a perspective of wealth building. And so if you decide you want to buy a house and you want to do this process, this wealth building process, pay attention to everything about the property. You know, I think it's interesting that we say do an inspection. On this particular property, as a matter of fact, there was an inspection that was done by these buyers. I got to look at that inspection. That inspector wrote about in the inspection, he couldn't find the crawl space to get under the house to determine if there was anything to do with the foundation. What? That's totally unacceptable, number one. And he also, on the same inspection, said he couldn't get into the panel area in the garage where the electrical system was because there was stuff in the way. And then the realtor for the buyer at that point should have said to the selling agent, this person, owner, listen, move that stuff so that we can do a proper inspection. So this thing, the can was kicked down the road, and the fact is that now they're sitting here with this circumstance, and they've lived in the house for 3 years or 2 years, however long they lived there. And they've lived in it, but they honestly don't know what the underpinnings of this house are, which we uncovered during our inspection. And now they may very well have to eat whatever they can't sell this for to cover the payoff of their mortgage. So you don't want to be this person, which is the buyer here, but all of these sellers, look at what they made, 28, 17, 10%. There's nothing wrong with the market. What's fueling the market is the market itself, which are all the buyers and the sellers. So I just really want to get very clear with you that this real estate thing that everyone's talking about, the unaffordability of it, isn't something that can be corrected by government. That's the biggest thing. That the government isn't going to be able to step in, because when the government does all of that and they start putting regulations on, you're not going to be able to fix it. This is the problem, supply and demand. So yes, there is conversation that the government wants to make more housing or build more housing. And yet, we're building houses here, and the cost to build a home, right? You have materials that you have to use. You have to have the plumbing materials, and the HVAC materials, and the electric materials, and the brick and mortar, and the slab, and the plumbing, and everything else that goes into constructing a home. Those things have gone up too because of the things that happened with the inflation. So not only during the unicorn years did we have this shortage of inventory, supply and demand, we also had too much money being poured into the system by the federal government to bail people out, which also increased this thing called inflation. So it was a double whammy. And here we are, and I will say, because we've been through this before, we will always get through it again. And I am always a proponent of buying real estate, no matter what the market is. Because if you find a deal in a market, which is always possible, you will begin to build generational wealth. That is the long and the short of this. So if you feel like you want to have a question about this, or you didn't understand something that I said, please schedule a Zoom call with me, because I love to share about this information. Because it isn't just about, okay, I'm going to buy a house. I'm going to go on Zillow. I'm going to look up a house. I'm going to call a real estate agent. Do you know how many real estate agents probably don't even know half the stuff that I just shared with you? But the thing is that you want somebody that actually knows this so that they can share with you, this is too much. And then it's up to you to decide, do I want to ignore that advice, or do I want to move on to the next house? Fortunately, in this case, we moved on to the next house. If you want more information, check me out. Y'all come back now, you hear?